and I'm not a host.
All righty. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Megan Arisman with the McCombs Plus program. We provide coaching, manage plus projects, and offer leadership workshops and webinars like this one. This webinar is part of our monthly webinar series that is sponsored by McCombs Plus. I encourage you to check out our Canvas page. I was just chatting about where you can find all of our future workshop and webinar details, as well as links to recordings from previous ones, not just from this semester, but also some previous years as well. You're going to receive a link to this session following our session, and you will get the slides as well as the recording and any materials provided. We also have a survey that would be really helpful for you to fill out. We love to get your feedback, and we use it in all of our future planning sessions. We'll drop a link in the chat, as well as you'll receive it in the email. Today, we are pleased to welcome our wonderful McCombs Plus coach, Dr. Allison Alford, as she presents our webinar today, So What? The art of really saying something when you are put on the spot. Dr. Allison Alford has 17 years experience teaching university courses, and her specialties are value propositions, conflict resolution techniques, teamwork, meeting facilitation, and people skills for leaders. As a communication coach, Dr. Alford has worked with professionals and MBA students in the fields of engineering, tech, publishing, human resources, sales, finance, and more. She believes anyone can improve their communication skills with effort and energy. And here's a quote from Dr. Alford. Maybe she's born with it, maybe it's coaching. Dr. Alford holds an MA and PhD in communication studies from the University of Texas at Austin, as well as a BA in international studies from Texas A&M University. She currently lives in Waco, Texas, where she is a clinical assistant professor at Baylor University. She also runs her own coaching and consulting firm, Good Talk Communication Consulting. When she's not working, she enjoys reading, listening to podcasts, taking long walks with her family, and drinking an obscene amount of coffee, which I definitely relate to. So if everyone could please welcome our presenter today, Allison Alford.
Thank you, Megan. Really appreciate that intro. And I've already had my coffee this morning, so I'm ready. I'm pepped up for this conversation today. And if you're just joining us, thank you for being here. This is going to be a really simple and easy webinar, meaning you don't have to do anything, but hopefully by the end you have a takeaway of a tool to put in your toolkit that you can use moving forward. So we're going to talk today about being put on the spot. But before we get to that, I just want to reiterate what Megan said about where you can find me and where you can schedule coaching sessions with me. And that is through an online calendar scheduling, which is on my website, goodtalkconsulting.com. And then from there, you click on packages, and you can see this one in blue here is a link just for the Texas MBA coaching, and that takes you to my calendar. So you can go there and get on the calendar, and you have your hours that go for the whole year. You can use them all in one go in one big burst as you get ready for recruiting, or you can space them out over the year. I see a lot of students who do, either or. We either do 5-6 sessions right before on-campus recruiting, or maybe it's the very end of your MBA and you're thinking, I don't want to waste these things. Let's just talk about some leadership skills in June and July. So that's an option for you, and I want to direct you there and hope to see you in coaching. But today we're going to be talking about a communication tool that you can use when you are put on the spot. Okay, and by put on the spot, that means at a moment's notice that you are expected to talk, to have something to say. We're going to talk about the problem and the solution, the reasons why it works. In the middle, you'll have a chance to do a little bit of practice. That's just on your own paper, on your own device as you jot down some notes, so be ready for that. There'll be time for you to ask questions, and then we'll talk about alternative ways you can use this tool and where it comes from. So that's kind of the gist of what we'll be doing today. All right, so let's get to the problem, and that is being put on the spot. Again, being put on the spot means that all of a sudden someone has asked you to talk, and it creates this, there's a need for you to speak up. And MBA students and graduates with their MBA often find themselves in these circumstances. And why is that? It's because MBAs are expected to have an opinion, have a point of view, and be able to offer that expertise in the moment. Now, some of you, as I'm saying that, you might feel your blood pressure rising, to think, wow, is that what I'm expected to do? But really, there is a sense that individuals who hold MBAs have the ability to hold a point of view and offer that expertise and that expert opinion. And so that's really more than just regurgitating some information that you learned. That is synthesizing the information into a suggestion or an opinion on a topic. But when we're not expecting it, that can leave any of us feeling sort of, a momentary concern. What do I say? What do I do? My mind is blank. I don't know what to say. Or we have something to say, but we don't feel like we have enough to say and enough to actually converse about. So being put on the spot, we also might call this impromptu speaking. And that's when you have to have very little preparation time. So if you're walking into a meeting, like a boardroom meeting, and you're told, okay, I'm gonna need you to brief everyone on how the project is going, and you get 2 minutes, or you don't even get 2 minutes. You're just pointed at the meeting and said, give us an update on the project. That feeling of being put on the spot, it can occur in casual conversation. It can occur when you're making introductions. I've met with a lot of students who say they have that feeling when they're supposed to ask questions of guest speakers who come into the classroom, and your mind just sort of goes blank. So what can happen is it creates a sort of a cycle of anxiety or nervousness if we haven't had success in the past from impromptu speaking. Then we're already worried about the next situation before it even gets there. And that nervousness or anxiety causes us to feel a lack of preparation, and it enhances the feelings of worry and concern, which certainly do not add to an excellent impromptu response. So if we've had a failure in the past, we may worry that we've embarrassed ourselves by saying the wrong thing. We had a little chat about that before the session started, that we can think about it for weeks of what we did say and what we should say. Some of us feel like we just freeze up or our face looks scared, and that can lead us to hold ourselves back the next time when it's time to speak up because we have had these negative experiences. So the solution for you today is to use a communication strategy. Now, every communication coach will tell you that every communication situation provides an opportunity to use a strategy, and that your feelings of nervousness can be reduced when you have an appropriate strategy to use. For example, you are all probably familiar with the idea of using STAR stories in behavioral interviews. So you have an idea of what is expected, and you are preparing the strategy to use. Now, the story will be different for each of you, but the strategy is the same. And so that's what we're talking about here today, is a strategy that you can use. And this image, as you see it right here, represents the technique of scaffolding. Okay, so scaffolding is approaching the response that we want to give in sort of a stair-step or building block way. And what that means is that we're going to be able to have more to say, but we don't have to come up with more ideas. We only have to explain ourselves more fully. And that's going to aid with clarity, because we won't feel like we misrepresented ourselves or our question, because we will unpack our discussion or our conversation. And that helps others to listen and remember and do their own response. So the solution for you is a communication strategy. And an important part of thinking about learning these strategies is that you are reducing cognitive load, right? Because one of the parts that makes us overwhelmed and nervous is this cognitive overload, and then a sensory and stress overload. So strategies reduce that cognitive load because they allow you to rely on something that makes the thinking work easier in that moment. So the goal here of learning this strategy is to make this a sort of a walk in the park, that you can use the strategy and you don't have to come up with everything on the spot. So essentially, we're doing a secret trick where you won't have to come up with on the spot the entire organization scheme. You just pick the topic and then unfold it. All right, so what is this strategic communication tool that I'm talking about? This is our 3-part tool that we will use, and those 3 parts are what, so what, and now what. Okay, so our 3-part tool is the questions what, so what, and now what. And we'll go over each of these individually and discuss how we can use them. But essentially, the what is the main idea or the topic, okay? This is where you present your key points. So what is sort of why it matters. I'm adding in a different question word by saying why, but this is the reasons. And these ideas to be relevant to what the audience cares about so that they can see that this topic is also important. And then now what is what to do about it. And as we look through these 3 parts going forward, I want you to recognize that each of these has a slightly different tone. But I also want you to think that what we're doing here is scaffolding. Another way to think about that, for those of you who love math, is this is an equation, okay? So 1 + 2 + 3 = success. And each time you use this tool, you will feel more confident going forward that you can use the tool again. All right, so let's move into the first part and learn about the what. Okay, the what is our main idea. Now, when we say main idea, what we mean is that we could have general information, or we could have a point of view, which then we want to build an argument for, or we want to persuade others about. And so I want you to think of this as the umbrella statement or the umbrella term of the sort of paragraph that you will be talking about. And so another way to think of that is that this is your topic sentence. This is the overarching main idea point, and ultimately it's going to be somewhat at a high level. So we want to keep our high level overview main idea concise, which means we're conveying the most critical piece of information first. And then what are we going to do? Then we're going to unpack it. Okay, so it might be like saying, here's a suitcase. And then in the following sections, we'll unpack that suitcase and talk about what to do with the suitcase. And that's how we end up filling in the space and having enough to say. All right, so let's move on to the second piece of that. And so we have what, and then we move on to so what. So after we've said the what, which is a concise sentence or two, we move on to explaining it. Okay, now when we say explaining it, we might be saying that this is the reasons why it matters, or we're saying more specific information about the main topic. All right, so if we are creating an argument and we're persuading someone to agree with our point of view because we were asked, you know, how do you feel about our football team this year? Then you have an opinion, and then you have your evidence to back up that opinion. So this is the place where we have our evidence, where we might bring in facts or information from other sources to support what we're talking about. So that's how it relates to if we have a persuasive argument. If we're informing and we're simply talking about, here's my suitcase, then this section is about giving more detailed, more specific, zoomed in descriptions of the item that we're discussing. So what you can tell here is that this tool can be used for informing and persuading. But the goal is start with an overview idea and then support that idea or further explain that idea. Now, here is the key element of this section, the reasons section. You really need to focus on what the audience needs and wants to hear in order to believe or agree with you, right? So if we are talking about this suitcase and I start talking about a time that I traveled to Peru, which actually happened the week before the COVID shutdown. That's a great story. Someday I'll tell you. The descriptions or the examples that I use to be relevant to the audience, either because I know the audience has traveled to Peru, the audience has traveled around the world, or because you can empathize with my story. It's important here in the reasons when we're saying why it matters, that we think about why it matters to this audience. Now, when I say audience, I mean whoever you're talking to, all right? So if we're at the board meeting, that's all of the people at the table. My audience today is all of the people on this Zoom call. But sometimes our audience can just be one person. And so we're thinking about what excites or interests or intrigues the person or the people that I'm talking to. And I want to make my reasons interesting to that person. So as I'm thinking, I'm trying to relate my so what, as in so what to this audience. Okay, so from this article, Abraham says that think about the bottom line for my audience is, and I want to talk about that thing, right? So that also will prevent us from the other person feeling like we're droning on and on, or that we are lecturing. Because when we're talking about things that our audience cares about, they're interested, they're involved, they're getting invested, and they're remembering and thinking about the things I'm saying, which will help us have conversation, because they're going to be able to respond because I've brought up something that's relevant to this audience. Okay, so let's move on to number 3 and look at the third part of this strategy. So this section is called Now What? We did so what, no, what, so what, now what? That's a lot of what. And this section, the tone of this section really is about action and the future, okay? So we told the main idea, then we said why it was an interesting or important main idea, and now we're going to say, what do you do with that? What could you do with it, or what do I want you to do with that information? So the listener who's paying attention right now knows we're going to talk about a call to action as well. So when we think about what to do in this section, we want to tell our audience what to do with that information. So if I'm describing this suitcase and I said, here's a suitcase, then I unpacked things from the suitcase. Here we are, that if I just stop and say, that's it, then the other person has no thread to pick up for us to have conversation. So the now what section is about letting the listener know what to do with this information, and also providing a way for them to pick up the conversation. So what do they do with this suitcase? I could say, here it is, you take it. Or you should think about buying one just like this. Or when you go on your next trip, this is the suitcase you want because it's airline friendly, or something like that. So these are, when we tell the audience what to do with the information, that is a call to action. So you might be thinking to yourself, if I'm just having a one-on-one conversation with, let's say for a networking event or for a friend, I don't want to tell them to do something, right? I can't tell people to do something with every point that I make. Do that because that would be quite presumptuous. So instead, I want you to think about how you can turn over the conversation to the other person by relating it to what the other person can now talk about. So if I'm saying something about the suitcase example again, I might say, this is what I do with suitcases. What do you think about suitcases? So turning over the conversation is also just a future-oriented lens in either getting the audience to do something or allowing the audience to easily respond to me. And this is our last chance to set the tone. What is the tone that I want to leave my audience with? So if I'm in a work setting and I've been asked for my opinion, and my opinion perhaps was critical of someone or an organization or an industry trend? Do I want to leave the audience feeling ho-hum and critical that something bad has happened? Or do I want to turn it to a positive turn and say, but the good news is we can work on this. And those choices are up to me, right? Based on what tone I want to leave someone with. And so when we do the now what section, those are the things we want to think about. How do I turn this back to the other person, back to the conversation, and how do I leave them with the tone, meaning my tone of voice, but also the tone of my words that leaves the impression that I was hoping to leave. Okay, so we've learned about the tool, what, so what, now what, and this is the solution to that problem of not knowing what to say, is to have a scaffolded response. Now, you still have to come up with a topic, but you don't have to come up with lots and lots of topics. You only need to have one piece of something to say, and then you have to unpack it and you relate it to the other person. Now, here's the really good news. When you're thinking of relating this topic to the other person, those people are going to like you because people like it when other people make it easy for them to converse, to talk about themselves, to use knowledge in their own lives. And so you can easily move on in the conversations because you have made this audience-centered. So this tool is something that you can put in your toolkit. It's very simple. It's only 3 steps. It's also very easy to remember. All 3 steps include one of the same words, but it's logical, meaning it's a phased response. It's a scaffolded response. And our imagery that we have on our slides here, I thought it kind of evoked architecture for us, right? What you're doing is you are the architect of conversations. And so rather than thinking, I need to sound important or I need to sound smart, if you focus on the architecture of your response, those outcomes will occur without having to try very hard for them to occur. But even more important, because this is audience-centered, you will find that the audience finds you likable, and likability is way more important in forming relationships and creating, business dealings than being able to come up with exactly the right comment on the spot, right? So what I want you to think about is it's less important that I say just the right topic or that I have just the right opinion. I can revise my opinion later. I can come back and say, I thought about that and I have more to add. So the goal actually is just to leave people with a feeling or an overarching tone from having interacted with you. So this is what the system or the process looks like when we use this tool. Okay, so we start here at the top. You're asked for your opinion on a topic. Then you do a little bit of thinking and scaffolding. So you're asked for your opinion. Of course, the first thing that happens is, right? Your mind goes, I'm supposed to have an opinion. And what am I going to say? This is where you recall the tool. What, so what, now what? And even if you're thinking as you're talking, the scaffolding approach will help you to end up sounding really good by the time you're done. Okay, so you do a little bit of thinking and scaffolding, and then you answer what. This is a high-level description of your opinion or the idea. You consider your audience and think, what is it that I could say about this opinion that they'll find reasonable and interesting? We're down here on light blue. Then I move to so what, and I describe why these ideas are relevant. Relevant means relevant to the audience, as well as relevant to the question that I was asked. And then your thinking is, I got through that, parts 1 and 2, nailed it. Then your thinking shifts to, I need to tie this all together and remember what tone I want people to have as a lasting impression. And that's when you answer with now what? And this is where you think about impression management and giving a call to action. And when you use this tool, again, to reiterate, the most important outcome that you get is that people are, they feel a certain emotional response. It's not as important that you have recalled just the exact perfect fact. It's mostly important that you have engaged, that you have explained your engagement, and that you've attempted to include them in that explaining and in that thinking. So you're really doing some relationship building. And I find that this takes the lens off of me thinking, what am I saying? What's coming out of my mouth? What's happening? And it turns the lens to, how's the audience doing? Are they getting it? Are they liking what I'm saying? Can I make it more interesting, more likable, more relevant? And it turns my thinking onto the other person, which tends to help me get out of my head, right? And that is, I think, what most of us need when we're thinking about being put on the spot is how do we get out of our head? So let's go ahead and do some practice here, okay? And I have a clock I'm going to use to give us a 3-minute countdown. And I'm going to give you a question here. So on your own document, this could be a piece of scratch paper. It could be on your phone in the notes section, on your laptop if you open a quick document, or if you have none of that, you could just write it in your head. I'm going to ask you a question that many MBAs are asked. And this could be asked of you from your grandma to someone who's doing recruiting, to 2-3 years from now that someone could ask you. And so I want you to think about answering this using what, so what, and now what. All right, I think you're probably ready for the question. I primed it well enough. All right, so here's the question. Why did you pursue an MBA? Why did you pursue an MBA? So I'm going to start our clock at 3 minutes, and we're just going to take this time for you to try to jot down or come up with a few responses, a few simple pieces of information to what, so what, and now what. If it helps you, you might think in your head about which audience you're addressing, right? Whether that's grandma, a recruiter, or 5 years from now, a colleague who's thinking about pursuing their MBA. So if it helps you, keep the specific audience in mind and write down some quick answers to these questions. Now, here's the good news. I'm not going to ask you to read it out loud if you don't want to. Okay, so jot down some quick answers here. Now, some of you write really fast, so you may be done. Then you can admire the scaffolding on my slide as we think about scaffolding our answer. As you're writing, tune me out if you need quiet while you're writing. I want to remind you some things that you can say. For what, you need to say the one main reason why you pursued your MBA. You might have 5. Pick just one. Pick just one. Now, considering our audience, we may not want that answer to be, I want more money, right? That could be a true answer, but perhaps not the answer that we give when asked this question by certain audience members, right? And I'm going to show you an example, a sample answer to this question in a minute. So then as I say, I pursued my MBA because X, then I'm going to say some more about that. This happened in my career, which led me to thinking about X. And I realized that if X was important to me, I needed to get an MBA. And you may have had that experience too. So I'm thinking about relating it to things that the audience is interested in or that we have in common. And then when I come to now what, I have 2 choices. Now what is how am I using my MBA now that I'm pursuing it, or how I plan to use it, or how I have used it now that I've finished it? Or now what can be me turning back to the other audience member to ask them why they're interested in this, or how an MBA matters to them. Okay, we've got 15 seconds to finish up some of those responses. Okay, so our time is up for our quick response section here. So what I want to do is, first I want to say, if you would like to type your answer or some questions into the chat box, now is a great time. I'm going to go over a sample response with you so you can see one way that I would answer this and some recommendations for you to answer this. But if you have some specific questions as you try to tackle that question with that tool, then please put them in the chat box and we'll have a moment to answer your questions in just a few minutes. Okay, so here's a sample of how you might respond using what, so what, and now what. Okay, so let's start with what. This is the big overarching idea. So you might say something like, I pursued an MBA to learn more about international business relationships. You can sub in here the thing you care about: tech, finance, critical thinking, green energy, healthcare. You could sub in here and say, because I had a moment of revelation in my current job that while I was good at it, I had a lot more to offer. You could sub in a moment of revelation that you'd always wanted an MBA, but you realized it was now or never. You needed to go do it now, or you might never push yourself to do it. The answer to this can be anything that is true and that is reasonable to say out loud to the audience that you're talking to, okay? So if your spouse ever asks you and you want to say money, please say money, right? But if a recruiter asks you, definitely don't say money. Because they are really, the question shows an interest in you exposing your thinking, okay? And that's what this tool allows, is that it creates, there are no trite answers if you use this tool, because it pushes you to explain your thinking. So now we have, so what? And here you're going to use, in this case, reasons. Those reasons can relate to your past experience as well as things that the audience is interested in about your current or past experience, okay? And so you might say something like, and this is a very common scenario for clients who I work with, as an engineer in the oil and gas industry, I work with a lot of cross-functional teams around the world. These relationships and projects really sparked my curiosity about global business dealings. I came to McCombs to learn more about international business and leverage that within my field. I could easily say, I came to McCombs to learn about international business and see how I could pursue that in other fields. The answer should be true to you, and also as best as possible, incorporating things you think the audience cares about or wants to know when they were asking. So we're also sort of doing our best to double, triple understand the question, where their question is coming from. But we're not asking them to unpack their question. We're going to unpack our thinking. Okay, and so the next part is now what? Now, this is, if you're still currently pursuing your MBA, as you are, and you're asked this by a recruiter, the now what is about the future and how you're going to use the MBA. I'm excited to use what I learned in classes like ops, marketing, or during my MBA Plus project as I go into my future career. And you can be very specific, my future career at Dell, or my future career in product management. After completing the MBA, my goal is to continue working with international partners in the oil and gas industry. And so what I'm saying here, especially if I'm talking to a recruiter, is I'm going to try to align the things I say I want to do with what they do, because now I'm making it very mentally easy for them to understand why I've applied for their job, or why I'd like to work there, or why I'd be a good fit. And so we can tailor our answer each and every time. Now, you might have thought, I didn't realize I'd be coming here for a job talk. I didn't realize I'd be coming here for an on-campus recruiting question. But that's the beauty of coaching. It's a 2-for-1 sometimes. So I hope that this is an answer that you write down And I hope that you also write down some answers like this to questions like why consulting, or why product management, or why are you switching to a new field? Because those are not behavioral interviewing questions. Those are questions about your thinking. Okay, and so those are opportunities for you to make your thinking transparent, which aids the other person in understanding you. All right, so here's the space that we have for questions or feedback. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I'd love to hear from you. So if you want to unmute and say something, or you want to type, what are you thinking about this tool so far? Type that in the chat. I'm just going to pause here for a minute to see if somebody has something to add.
Hi, listen. This is Mani.
Hi, Mani.
Hi. So yeah, when looking at that question, like why do you want to pursue an MBA? So immediately, apart from these three strategy points, so I have like, okay, what experience that I have, and what are the skills that I have? That is one thing that I have in mind, and then what I'm expecting from this MBA. That is the second question I have in my mind. So what is that I am expecting comes in now what, or so what? There's a question. I mean, so
Okay, great question. Yeah. So first, Mani said you have your past experience, and then second, you said you have your expectations from the MBA. So thank you, Mani, for this question. This is a great question. And I want to say that so we're going to put your experience in the so what. Now, here is where students often make mistakes in recruiting. You start by listing experience items. Don't start there. Start with the main point. The main point is, I chose an MBA because X. Or if the question is, what do you want to do with your MBA? I want to use my MBA for X. That's where we start. Many, many people start with their evidence before they say their point. And all it does is stall the listener from understanding your point. And this is especially true in oral presentations, in conversation, in speaking, because we don't have anything written and I can't glance up and glance back. So the what, so what, now what keeps the point in the most logical order for the listener. So we're going to say, why'd you pursue an MBA? I pursued an MBA because X. Then Mani will use our experiences after that. So after experiencing oil and gas for 10 years, or being a subject matter expert in my field, or traveling around the world, doing projects, I realized that, and then we need to say something that ties back to our main idea, because we're saying the main idea and then why the main idea is true. So we use evidence and then reiterate the main idea. Okay, so this sort of scaffolding is very critical for the listener to actually get what you're saying. And if you put these things in the wrong order, they can get confused. And what it tends to lead to is you either repeat yourself or the listener is just not engaged, right? Because they got lost in what you were saying. So Mani, your second question was, where do I put my expectations from the MBA? So the first thing I would ask you is this related to the same question? If not, you might need to just finish your answer for this one about why did you pursue it, and think of expectations as a second answer. So you could even start a new section of what, so what, now what, just on your own, and say, another thing I can tell you about is my expectations for the MBA. My expectation is X. That's because Y. And so those expectations have led me to Z. Okay, so that would be my suggestion, Mani, is to make sure that you're not overloading the one question with answers to multiple questions. This strategy is most helpful for keeping us on track with one primary answer that we fully explain and unpack. And then we allow the conversation to continue. And the other person asks new or different questions, or we ask questions back. And you will probably find that you have an opportunity to answer that other question, that follow-up question. So the only tiny point would be here in the now what section. You could just briefly say what you want to do with your MBA, but that's slightly different than what did I come in expecting from the MBA. So it's up to you to determine, are these the same question or are these different questions? So Mani, does that answer what you were asking?
Yes, right. Thank you, Alison.
Yes, no problem. Okay, so Nicole says, thought-provoking, thank you. William says, how would you respond if you really didn't have an opinion formed yet or did not feel knowledgeable enough to answer? William, I appreciate that question. You can still use what, so what, now what to describe your thinking about how you need to think about it. Or this would be an example of a time when you graciously respond, you know, that's a great question. It's something that I need to consider. What is it that made you think of that? Okay, so William, the response here is if I absolutely don't have anything to say, then I could graciously bow out, but I need to keep the conversation going. So that's when I use questions to redirect the conversation back to the other person and encourage them to talk. That's very audience-centered. And I have another webinar that you can watch that's about asking great questions. So if you're interested in how to redirect conversations with questions, you can watch that. And so Francis said, do you have any tips, best practices for body posture when it comes to reacting to very challenging ad hoc questions in front of a crowd? For example, if someone asks you a sticky question, you need to collect your thoughts. Do you look up, shift posture, use filler, etc.? That's a great question, Francis. Each of us, first of all, has a natural style, and I want to encourage you to feel comfortable in your own skin and your own body and mostly do what comes naturally to you. But I do personally tend to look away. And so I often just kind of look over to the side, but I like to use filler terms as I'm doing that, as I'm doing my thinking. So I might say something as I did, as I suggested to William, something like, that's a great question. Wow, you really sparked my interest. You know, while I haven't thought about that a lot before, what I'm thinking right here on the spot is, and then X. So some filler, and I could even alert the person that this is me thinking out loud. That kind of depends on how comfortable I am with the other person. So that filler is an important part of conversation as well. And that filler, that's something I talk to students a lot about between getting asked a question in an interview and starting your STAR story, that you have a space of a little bit of filler, which also allows you a tiny bit of thinking time that can help you get your feet under you. And those things happen best with practice. So practicing the filler and the thinking at the same time. But if I'm given 2 full minutes, I'm absolutely going to take notes. I'm going to open up my phone, open up a notes document, and write down 3 words of things that I wanted to say. I probably won't have to look at them, but just by writing them down, I've clarified and reorganized my thinking. Okay, so thank you, Francis. And Jaron said, this is useful to pair with the STAR framework. Absolutely. Now, Jaron, I think the STAR framework is incredibly important in behavioral interviewing. But here's the thing. If you have an entire day-long interview, or you're on your 5th interview and some of the same people are there, sometimes it's good to mix it up, right? Because a STAR response to every single question can get a little old. So I think that what, so what, now what is another scaffolding technique. Just like STAR, there's another technique that I've talked about before called PREP, which is point, reason, example, point. And the key here is just pick a strategy. Pick a strategy and use a strategy, but you can always rely on the strategy rather than feeling completely blank. Okay, so thank you for these questions. And let's keep going. I want to be mindful of your time. So what are some situational alternatives where we can use the what, so what, now what? Well, this is not just useful in being put on the spot for small talk. It's also something, as I mentioned, you can use for Q&A. So if you are the Q&A presenter, or if you're asking a question of a speaker, right? And you want to ask a question that sounds intelligent. You can ask the question, support the question with, you would make a point of something you were thinking about, support that with evidence, and then ask the question, right? So in that case, now what would be your question to the speaker? But you scaffolded it and explained it. The second way you can do this is with pitching. So the students in my MBA strategic communication class are using this to pitch their idea. And so if we're pitching a proposal, whether we want buy-in or we want money, we can say, what's the idea? So what? What's the ROI? What's the investment? What's the feasibility? And then now what is the plan and the implementation and the call to action? We can introduce people and things. I'll show you that on the next slide. Or we can give other people feedback. So if people ask us for feedback about our performance or, any of those things, any type of feedback, but a lot of times it's going to be performance related, we can feel really nervous about giving someone appropriate and critical feedback. The what, so what, now what format helps you to say your feedback, but explain it in a way that shows sensitivity and emotional intelligence. All right, so let's look at how we could introduce people. You can introduce things and people. So here is an introduction. So I'm talking to somebody and somebody else walks up and I'm in a business setting. And so I want to be professional and I want to make sure to loop these people in to the relational conversation and not just say, hey, this is so-and-so, this is so-and-so. This is the way I might introduce someone. Or I could turn this into a 2-3 minute discussion of someone if I'm introducing a speaker. So let me introduce you to Amal. So what? Here's a little bit of information about her. She's a human rights attorney who travels around the world advocating for the underrepresented. I could say she got her degree from here, she lives here, she works at this place. I can pick and choose items that will match or matter to the people that I'm introducing. And then now what is the two of you have a lot in common because you both love George Clooney. So that is recommending that they think of each other as new acquaintances or in a friendly way. You may have recognized this is Amal Clooney, who I have a tiny crush on. So the what, so what, now what format can be used in a variety of ways and ultimately as a tool to keep in your toolkit. And you're not going to become familiar with it unless you practice it. So I said at the outset in the title, that this is the art. But I want you to also know that this is kind of art, kind of science, right? We did say it's also a math formula. So I want to tell you where this tool came from. Originally, this tool, these called STEM questions, came from Terry Borton, who created these questions for reflective practice in teaching. So kind of an interesting thing is that you can use this for reflective practice, meaning if you have an experience and you want to go home and you're just processing, maybe it's a process with some scaffolding, okay? So these questions came from this work 50 years ago, and modern day, they're often used in the literature, in publications, in caregiving, caretaking research publications, that is for patient providers to reflect on their caretaking behaviors. So when we think about, it's in a lot of the nursing literature, that nurses and practitioners reflect on their experiences. Ultimately, you could use this as a reflective practice every time you engage with a client or when you engage with a team member, you want to think about your leadership. So anytime you're having that growth mindset, you could go back to this tool and help scaffold your thinking in that way. So it's both an art and a science, but it's really up to you to apply the framework in any given situation. And so I challenge you to try to use it. And maybe you just use it in simple conversation, or maybe you actually write something down and have something substantial, written to take away with you. So this tool is a tool for every time. It's a universal tool. That's why I love it. But each of us are going to find we like or use different tools differently. So again, you have to make it your own. But if you're put on the spot, remember, there's always a communication strategy that you can leverage. And as soon as we're leveraging a tool, we feel less nervous. And so these questions help you to have something substantial to say, something that you have unpacked and you have made transparent your thinking. But you can use this in a variety of places, and you can always call upon some strategy. And overall, the goal of talking about this today is for you to know that if this is an area of weakness, you can improve it through practice, and you can also improve it through coaching. So that's why the coaches, such as myself, we're here for you. We love to talk about these things, or interviewing, recruiting, conflict, being your best self, leadership, all kinds of things I talk to students about. So whatever's on your mind, that's a great thing to pursue coaching for. So you go to the Texas McCombs Canvas page. I think it's Texas MBA. It says Texas MBA. And you click on training and development, and then you can click on Plus Talk or the webinar recording. And this recording will be there soon. So if you really loved it, you can redirect all your friends to see it. And if you want to get in contact with me, you can email me, and you can find me on my page, goodtalkconsulting.com. So I'm really glad that you were here today, and I'll turn it back over to you, Megan. You're muted.
Of course I am. That's just this week. If you have any questions, drop in the chat, or go ahead and come off of mute to ask Allison while we've got a little bit of time. The other thing I want to just clarify, our Canvas page is called Texas McCombs Plus Program.
Okay.
And I'll drop the links in the email that we'll send afterwards.